Welcome to Kindred. This is Lisa Reagan, and today I'm talking with Andrea Dole, a mother of a child born with multiple disabilities who is not expected to live according to medical doctors, and who is thriving today. Andrea credits her son James' resilience to her determination to follow her own heart and nurture James, not abandon him to institutional care. When Andrea found the book Restoring the Kinship Worldview by Arrows and Darcia Narvaez, she found the worldview framing she needed to validate her choice to follow her wisdom and James's leads. Darcia Narvaez's book, The Evolved Nest, provided further scientific backing for Andrea, so much so that she recently presented her story to a group of Vanderbilt pediatricians in hopes of normalizing nurturing for disabled children and creating policy support for the families who care for them. Today, we will hear Andrea's story, and later in the call, Arrows and Darcia Narvaez will join us to unpack Andrea's experience with worldview and evolvedness framing. Most importantly, we are presenting Andrea's experience to empower other parents who are struggling to make counterculture choices for wellness. Welcoming a wisdom-based, wellness-informed world has been Kindred's nonprofit mission and vision for over 2 decades. So welcome, Andrea. Thank you so much for coming to Kindred and telling us your story.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you for all the good work and resources that you're putting out in the world. It's wonderful to be part of this community.
So can you start by telling us your story with James and his birth, and what were you expecting and what happened that was different?
Yeah, thank you. I might tear up a little bit. Yeah, well, I guess what I'd like to share is, let's see. So before James was born, I had been pretty terrified of hospitals and birth in general, and had done a lot of work myself on educating myself. I took a doula class at the recommendation of a friend, and felt really empowered in that class, and understanding of the natural birth process, and empowered in my local community that there were multiple midwives around who did home birth. So I was determined to have a home birth, and found a doula that I felt really connected with, who had a lot of experience, who I felt really confident with. And so I was living at a small home with a big garden, and we had a beautiful home birth. I got to walk around the garden and while I was in labor, and up and down the stairs in my own home with my husband and the doula and midwives there. And I think the point that I guess I didn't really realize, maybe the midwives realized that something was a little different, was that I never had the urge to push. And so I had to be kind of coached through the pushing phase of my labor. But having never given birth before, I didn't really know there was anything different about that. So James was born about just before 8 in the morning on a Sunday morning, and came out and laid on my belly and chest and looked up at us with the most beautiful sparkly eyes with the longest eyelashes my husband and I had ever seen. Just so bright blue, these eyes, and picked up his head immediately and looked right at us with these gorgeous eyes. And we just were flooded with this feeling of his spirit and his presence. And we looked at him and said, wow, I guess their heads really do come out looking a little funny. Because he had this little like cone head, and but we were so in love, we didn't really think anything of it. Meanwhile, the midwives noticed that he had a abnormally small head, and was having a little bit of trouble breathing, and they gave him some oxygen right away, and they just decided that it would be a good idea to call an ambulance. So I was with James for that first hour right there in our home, before we were rushed to our local hospital, and started a process of hearing various diagnoses from various doctors. And it turned out he has a rare genetic form of microcephaly where the brain stops developing at some point during gestation. And so then the head, the cranium, actually, we learned, grows to accommodate the brain. So that would explain the small head size and small birth size. He was just under 4 pounds. And yeah, so a bit different than what we had anticipated. And, in the first 4 days of his life, we were in 3 different hospitals: our local hospital, the hospital an hour away, and then a hospital 2 hours the other direction, meeting with specialists and hearing various diagnoses and prognosis for his life, a lot of which didn't necessarily resonate with our awareness of who James was as a person.
What was the recommendation for James?
Well, I think that the I'm just going back through, right from the time we got to the first hospital, the feeling was, oh, I'm so sorry. They looked at us with these sad puppy dog eyes, like, oh, I'm so sorry, and just kind of imparted this feeling of doom, that was very strange. And then when we met him up in Bangor, and he was in his little plastic box hooked up to monitors, and I was trying to nurse him, the pediatricians made sure to bring us all into a room together because our family had come up to meet us, and the midwife and doula had come up, brought us into a room and said, it's likely that your son won't live very long. We don't know how long, maybe a couple days, maybe a couple weeks. But they were very, very, I remember them being very sure about it and very clear about it. And then a couple days later, the next day, when the pediatrician on staff that day read the MRI that they had to send to the other hospital, so he was just reporting back, the way that he chose to speak about James's brain and condition was pretty horrifying. So yeah, just for any sensitive listeners, it hit like a ton of bricks. He said, your son is like a chimpanzee. He'll never think or feel anything. And the subtext was, don't bother attaching to this child. He's not going to be around long. It was very clear to me in that state that was the subtext, and there were no alternative narratives that were offered. In fact, the social worker that was there in the room with us when he delivered that news was just in tears herself, and basically gave us a gas card to get to the next hospital. But no alternative narratives, no resources about disability or parent networks, anything to support us with that kind of prognosis and diagnosis. So it was really hard to digest, especially, yeah, I mean, I don't know, especially what, especially after having such an empowering experience of giving birth. Um, it 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 was just didn't jive with my understanding of who my child was, who we were as parents, and kind of set up a pretty powerful trauma response in me as someone who was already pretty scared of hospitals. It made me very wary of accepting medical advice, which then put me in a very challenging position in relation to seeking out medical care for my very vulnerable child who, you know, has continued to need medical care.
So, Andrea, you did move away from the medical recommendations and you did choose to nurture James. And you've talked in other media interviews about that process of calling in your family and your community and having backup at least to help you with that very intense need that James had for nurturing, especially in the beginning. So that was a huge counterculture choice to make based on your own intuition. And you've also said you were responding to James's lead throughout this process. You really considered what was he signaling to you that he needed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and now he is thriving. I'm just looking at our time right now because in just a minute, Arrows and Darcia Narvaez are going to jump on this call with us. So I want to skip real quick to you just presented to a group of Vanderbilt pediatricians your choice to nurture your son over the last couple of years. And you feel like the framing for that was the framing for your choice was provided with the Restoring the Kinship Worldview by Darcia and Four Arrows, and then the Evolved Nest, which is the a scientific holistic theory pioneered by Darcia Narvaez that shows we need nurturing to thrive. That's just who we are as a species. So when I talked to you first, you said, well, this is what gave me the strength to stand in front of the pediatricians and say, look, now I can tell you the science behind my choice, which was a pretty powerful,
Mm-hmm.
empowering statement to make for all parents. What's going to happen if you follow your instincts to nurture, which is a counterculture choice right now, at least in America. But we're also at the bottom of 193 other developed nations for all wellness rankings, so that's not working out real well for us.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? We're gonna Four Arrows is here. So with that quick segue into the big picture, I think I'll go ahead and let him in, and I know we want to hear more about this recent presentation that you made. So let's welcome Four Arrows. He's coming in from, I think, Mexico, so it might take a minute. Andrew, why don't you go ahead and tell us about a little bit about reading the Restoring the Kinship Worldview book and what that did for you.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciated that book. I actually listened to it on Audible, as a lot of the books that I've listened to since becoming a mother and, having to be hands-on a lot of the time or needing to take a walk while I'm reading. And it was so wonderful to listen to Darcia and Four Arrows in conversation with one another. And I really appreciated that approach. And their ability to navigate conversationally so many of the facets of what it means to live a healthy, connected life that's connected to the natural world and our spirits and one another in community that's respectful. it really gave me so much strength and hope for the ability to navigate between worldviews. Just having the worldview framed, um, it made things so much clearer, about how to talk about these different values that I feel intuitively as a mother. It gave me a really powerful framework, which has continued to bolster my work with state policy to support children and families who have complex medical needs and disabilities.
So Andrea, I just want to tack on to that, and then I'm going to introduce Four Arrows. I just want to tack on to that piece because this is something we hear at Kindred a lot, is the worldview piece comes first, and then the evolved nest piece comes, because the evolved nest fits inside and hails from our indigenous worldview and wisdom. And so you moved from reading the Restoring the Kinship Worldview to the Evolved Nest book after that. And you quoted from the Evolved Nest book extensively in your presentation to the Vanderbilt pediatricians. Is that right?
Yeah, it was such great timing. I had wanted to pick up the book for a while, and it was on the new shelf at the library just as I was preparing for the presentation. And as I was reading it, I had this aha moment, like, oh, this is exactly what we did. And this is the science that will make it more digestible for these medical students to understand what I'm talking about as just the mom in the situation. So it was a great support for that presentation. And it really helped me to show up with my authentic voice and share about our experience on equal footing with the learning that that the medical students had been getting, because I could relate on the science platform as well.
So great to hear, Andrea. I'm one of those moms too that looked at the worldview and the evolved nest piece and said, oh my gosh, okay, now I have language and framing and validation for following my own innate wisdom. And so with that, I want to welcome Four Arrows and Darcia Narvaez. Thank you so much for coming today to talk with us. And I guess maybe we'll start with Four Arrows, because we want to move from this big picture worldview piece. And it was very significant, as you were saying, Andrea, that you were presenting to medical students. And even in the presentation, which we'll make available to everyone wherever they find this podcast, you'll get to see Andrea's part. But there's also this piece in the beginning, the framing of the worldview that exists right now in America when it comes to people with disabilities, but also how that hails from our mechanical view of the body, which is something that was stated in this presentation, surprisingly. So, Four Arrows.
Well, I had the opportunity to be listening to your words, Andrea, and it's just so powerful how you say it and what you say, and I think that this is more and more becoming realized. Even for my presentation in a couple of days in Montana at the Blackfoot International Research conference. I'm going to be kind of bold there, and I mean, because I'm in Indian country with a lot of top scholars, and I'm going to kind of start out by saying that because the name of it's going to be tricky in a way, because the name of the conference is Culture as Medicine, and what I'm going to kind of do is start out with a quote that comes from George Duhamel in his 1912 book, but was also cited in similar ways by Einstein and also by Emerson, that says that without continual worldview reflection, culture can become that which remains what we have forgotten. I think that I can't speak French very well, but I'm looking at it right here in French. La culture est, whatever. But it's culture is that which remains if one has forgotten everything. So not all the time is culture the medicine that it can be. And I think looking at that even indigenous cultures like the Blackfoot Reservation is suffering as the Lakota is in terms of alcoholism and suicide rates, etc. And so what happens to a culture, I believe, is when that vital place-based knowledge that requires the language of the land and the ceremonies of the land and the knowledge of the land, when that gets to be lost and the worldview is lost, I think what is essential, especially in places where people have been relocated, is bringing this worldview that Darcia and I dialogued about in our book, and as you so beautifully described, bringing that back as a way to encourage the place-based knowledge to be surviving and thriving again, or if it's absent, to re-indigenize ourselves as best we can with the languages that we have to that place base. So I just want to bring that out because I think that in a way, then not in many ways the culture is the most important because it's place-based. It's where people are in the ground working it and saving the ways of being that can make it thrive. But when that starts to get lost because of the world we're in, I think worldview is the key.
The evolved nest, you take off from the worldview and the context of how we should exist as a species in order to achieve this full potential of our well-being. And you point out we're an atypical species right now. We're in a cycle of competitive detachment. We need to get back to our culture of cooperative companionship, which is based on normalizing nurturing, but we're so far from there. And I'm just wondering what your reaction is to Andrea's story and, closing the gap. She's doing extraordinary work as a parent by herself, closing the gap and using these tools of the worldview and evolved nest to do so. What do you have to share on that?
Well, Andrea, it's so wonderful to hear your story. I watched the video, and you are very articulate about what is needed and how difficult it is to do these things on your own, which is not our species' normal way of existing. So in a species typical community, there'd be a lot of helping hands and whatever is needed by an individual, a child, an adult, would be provided without question. Why would you, even question the need? And it would be a shared giving, a shared accompaniment, which you do so beautifully and show so beautifully with your child, James. So we need to get back to a sense of the village being all of us together on Earth, and that we're here to help each other thrive, to flourish. And your example, your saintly example, gives us a way to look at that, a way to know what that means, and offers some hope that we can get back to an understanding of our fellowship with one another, our companionship, our accompaniment, no matter who we're with, no matter where we are, we can offer those helping hands, as you show so well.
I really second that. In the Lakota language, you hear this phrase almost daily. How kolapi, o kichiapi makio kipi na ayuteche kuche wayo kepi metakueo yasin. And I probably, my brothers would probably laugh at me at how poorly I pronounced all that. But what it translates is, hello, friends, help each other acclimate and adjust. because the truth is we're all related. And I think that's what Darcia just said, is that that's how we lived. And now, that phrase is often said because, this is getting this idea of this interconnected, interdependent community is getting lost.
The Aleut have a greeting. They say in their language, "Hello, my other self." And I think that's what we are. We need to get into that mindset, that mind space, that life way of realizing that all the living beings around us are our other selves. We are all one together.
Mhm.
Darcia, I was just thinking that, back where I'm going is where, that's where Maslow did his internship, right? So I'm going to be in that place. And I'm just wondering if this idea of that he embraced really in his heart, but just not in the scholarship, the idea that when a baby is born and you lift that baby up, if you're really seeing a self-actualized entity like he discovered, if you're really seeing that, then isn't it sort of like automatic that people are going to have this sense of respect for everyone?
Yeah, he got the whole thing upside down though, right? So he put self-actualization at the end point, towards the end point of his steps. And it turns out that the Blackfoot put it at the beginning, right? Self-actualization is how you start for community actualization to ensue so that there's cultural perpetuity. And he just kind of lopped off all that other stuff. And then he didn't realize that self-actualization requires for a baby all those basic needs at the same time. They need to feel secure, loved, esteemed, making meaning with others, and self-actualizing as they build their body and brain around experience. So he gave us a little flag about what's important, but the Blackfoot know it in a wise way, and we need to relearn that.
Yeah, and it almost defines that everyone's going to be involved, right? Because right from the beginning, hey, the goal is to keep this going, instead of, this separate leave, you're on your own now because you got a long way to go before you even come close to where I am, or whatever other interpretations of not being self-actualized at the beginning. But it's like, wow, okay, our goal now is to everybody to keep this happening, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful idea.
Yeah, and I think Andrea and James are showing this, the self-actualization of James, right? Through the supportive system that she provides and the family and the community, so that the family will live into the future. The community will self-actualize and bring out the beauty of James, of everyone who's supported through the evolved nest ways.
And Andrea, you saw the self-actualization where even this mighty medical profession didn't. And I mean that's what we're talking about.
That is what we're talking about. And that's what Andrea and I were talking about to begin with. Was the reason Kindred has existed this long is because parents who had a counterculture experience of bonding, connecting, and following the innate wisdom and lead of their child needed to have each other, at least for support. We didn't have the worldview metacognitive skills, and we didn't have the evolvedness science to back us up, but we knew that we had our children right in front of us who were thriving with our choices, and that's what we wanted to keep doing. Let me ask Andrea, do you have questions for Arrows and Darcia now that you've got them here?
Oh, it's so great to be in conversation with you both. I keep just lighting up hearing different pieces of what you're saying. One thought that I had when you mentioned Maslow, I don't know if either of you had it happen to listen to, there was a episode of The Hidden Brain that came out recently that featured a anthropologist, can't remember his name right now, who had a child with Down syndrome. who looked back at the history of folks with Down syndrome in America and looked at some information about Maslow and his friendship with Margaret Mead and the conversations that they had at the time when I believe it was Maslow who had himself had a child with Down syndrome, that Margaret Mead encouraged him to put in an institution at that time. And it's a beautiful episode. And I reached out to the anthropologist and thanked him for sharing his story. And it was also a story of people changing their minds over time, because later in her life, Margaret Mead changed her perspective on the importance of the diversity of human experience in the social fabric. And so it was really beautiful to get that insight, not only into kind of where things are now, but how we've gotten there and how people's perceptions can change over time through different life experiences.
Yeah, I think to give credit to Maslow also is he was very clear that it was beautiful. One of the letters that he wrote was, you know, I can't believe that over 80% of these people are self-actualized, whereas in my community at the university, it's lucky to be 8%, right? I mean, he really got it. He just, you know, didn't have the courage, I guess, or to sacrifice maybe it would have been to share that with the world. Yeah, and so I think that you know, that he knew in his heart and recognized that he wasn't in denial. So I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, and I might be mixing up my textbook people. I think it might have been Erickson actually who experienced, but it's so interesting that you brought up that that connection. And yeah, I've been really also enjoying the work of Bayo Akomolafe over the last couple years, and really appreciate his sharing of the idea of sloshy time. And I feel like you probably both, all of you would appreciate that as well. And for me, it's been healing in the sense of, you know, sometimes we feel like we're on this linear track of progress through time. And in his tradition, time is not linear. It's not even a spiral. It's sloshy, because even a spiral is a linear track just going around and around. So I love the healing potential of, you know, being able to go back in time and reimagine, and, you know, reimagine how things could be if we do things differently and think about things differently. It sort of fits into a more of a quantum indigenous framework of time. And it's very much, I think one of the things that was so heartening for me in reading both of, you know, all of your works is that it feels so natural to my experience of James, and that he is such a direct conduit of spirit and of, you know, the reality of physical and spiritual life apart from all the stories that we make about it. And so he speaks to me very clearly in a way that's similar to the birds and the wind and the earth itself.
Beautiful.
Andrea, I have to interject here and ask Darcia to talk for just a second about the trilogy of films the Evolved Nest has put out, because when you talk about reimagining humanity, using our rational and active imaginations to get us there, what would that look like? Darcia's done that for us. So do you want to tell us real quick?
Yeah, you can, as Lisa has promoted, you can change your life in 30 minutes with these 3 films. The first one, yeah, the first one, 6 minutes, is breaking the cycle. So it's contrasting the long time, million-year-old way of being with one another and our culture of cooperative companionship with the contemporary cycle of competitive detachment, which is what we're in. And so that's this cycle where you don't provide the evolved nest, don't provide for basic needs, create or foster people with dysregulation of all kinds, depending on their timing of experience, and adults then who aren't very well and they're not very wise, and then they keep this cycle going with not meeting the needs of the young, of the old, of everyone in between. And that's the cycle of competitive detachment. And the cycle of cooperative companionship, of course, is what we're talking about, where you provide the basic needs through the evolved nest, you create a well-functioning human being in all sorts of ways, and then you become a wise and well elder who fosters or keeps that cycle going of cooperative companionship. That's the first film. The second film is on the evolved nest and the different components of the evolved nest, and showing how different animals have similar components, have evolved nests that are very similar to the human. And then the third film is about reimagining humanity in 12 minutes. So it's what does thriving look like in a human being? What does thriving look like in a society, a community? And it's pulling from our ancestral wisdom from the contemporary hunter-gatherer civilization around the world. And that's the kind of thing we need to, reimagine, because we don't know any different than what we experience often, unless we're tuned into the spiritual realm. So it's trying to help people find a way forward that's hopeful and promising and motivating.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that Darcia's last book was about learning from animals. I'm working on a card deck about learning from animals. And the animals have been my greatest teachers of what Andrea is saying. And so I think that really brings us back to what Darcia and I have talked about is this idea that most of the stuff that even good-hearted people are trying to do, educators, scientists, is all based on the wrong baseline. They're using a baseline that is in itself is ill, and I think that getting back to animals allows us to remember the baseline. And I mean, we've got this Chola Quinte, the puppy that's a hairless Mexican dog, 4,000 years old. And it's just a little puppy. And last night, something happened. We don't know what, but neither B or I could approach it without it running under a bed. And for the last 3 weeks that we've had it, it's just been on our laps and wonderful. And it showed what I recall from my work with wild horses. There was something that happened that we had to deal with in a very, very special, different way. And of course, I won't go into detail. It all came out good, but I think that these creatures, especially those that are not domesticated, are such teachers for us. Now, I'm just wondering, Andrea, does James get to have any opportunities with animals?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I've been wanting to get him onto a horse, and I'm going to be looking into that. It's nice you mentioned the horses. They have such good medicine. Well, we live in the country here in Belfast, and James has always had a very special connection with the trees. We're pretty sure that he communicates directly with the trees. So he's got a lot of natural supports around him, and a lot of the wild animals that live right around our home, that, you know, the wood thrush, the hermit thrush that sings in the evenings. And yeah, so he definitely appreciates all the energies of the beings that are around, very much so. And we've been working for the last number of years with some elders who have had a guide service here in Maine since the 80s. So we've been carrying on the tradition of the Maine guide tradition, learning from the elders and bringing people out into the natural world. And so James has been out in the canoe with us, on the water. He loves being on the water and seeing the beautiful reflection of sun and water, and feeling that motion in the canoe.
Beautiful, beautiful.
When Andrea and I first started talking, I asked her about where she was living, because I had a sneaking suspicion that nature was collaborating with her in her healing. I was like, what do you say you do? Oh, we do these Earthway guides, and we live on a farm and we're out in nature. And I'm like, okay, there you go. You're right in the middle of source, and you got backup. That's fantastic. It was really
Yeah, I think the first time that I called you up, I was out at Ray and Nancy's house in Canaan, Maine, and I was harvesting nettles in their field, and Patrick was in the woods harvesting, digging up some basswood shoots to transplant over to our house. And we were taking a walk with our 6-year-old, and Ray, who's in his late 70s now, learning about the woods. And yeah, he's got a wonderful presence that has been very grounding for us. Similar to you all, we are a species that needs our elders, and that needs the wisdom keepers, and the people who have the wisdom of their experiences and their years to put the pieces together to help us learn how to walk better on the earth. And that's what Ray has been giving to us, at the same time as, you know, we do the heavy lifting to allow him to continue to be out in the bush and go on these canoe trips without having to lift the canoes himself. So it's been a nice reciprocal growth and care and nurturing of the nurturers. You know, it's like he and Nancy have recognized that we need nurturing too along our path, and support with how to create a life that is sustainable for our unique family. So I'm so grateful for that elder wisdom. And I think it's probably a big part of how I've been able to access and integrate the work that you all are doing, because it's something that we live in our life here.
We're at the top of our hour, and I know Darcia has another meeting to go to. And I wanted to be able to get just kind of the big picture wrap up here, Andrea, because what you're doing, you're still advocating as a parent for families who are really left right now. There are a lot of statistics we're going to include in this podcast, so you can see how critical this space is right now for families with children with medical complexities, as they're called, and how the majority of them are in crisis. 85%, over half are living in poverty because of medical bills. I mean, the numbers are shocking, and how marginalized, isolated, and invisible the families are who are saddled with doing this alone. So your story is really, I hope, going to reach a lot of people through Kindred, and our resources we want to make sure are there and intact for everyone to know and to hear the real message loud and clear, which is the Evolved Nest and Worldview provides for us is a different story. There's a different story here that we can turn to for validation in seeking wisdom and healing. So with that said, do I need to let you go, Darcia? Are you good?
I'm all right at the moment.
Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? 'Cause I was trying to be respectful of your time.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I have to throw in that we do have that wonderful worldview chart that Four Arrows has created, and it's getting ready to come out with a new update. And that was talked about in the Restoring the Kinship Worldview. And I have to say, from having a parent brain for so much of my life, looking at this almost a cheat sheet of the dominant worldview precepts, what does it look like? And the contrasting indigenous or kinship worldview, which is the relational intelligence precepts. Where is that coming from? That's also a really lovely tool that we have that will help people to kind of get started if you haven't considered what is your worldview, where are you operating from, where did that come from? It's a good starting point. So we have that for you. And does anybody have anything else that we'd like to say before we go?
Well, I'd just like to share my gratitude again to all of you for providing these frameworks that are deeply rooted in our long past and elder wisdom, because that's what we need, and that's what I need as I'm, working to help craft effective policy for the most vulnerable children, working with DHHS and Maine Care here in Maine to create the paid family caregiving program for children with medical complexity, with the recognition that caregivers need support and need to have their basic needs met in order to be able to provide the nurturing that these children need, and that it's bigger than that. The context is bigger in terms of what the social network can be striving toward to remap. And I've just been reading the latest issue of Orion magazine, and they've got an article in there about daylighting old streams that have been covered up through many decades of sewage water treatment, and it just reminds me so much of what the work that you all are doing and that parents are trying to do with their children is to bring light to what the real needs are of children, to be able to provide that nurturing space for the way forward. So thank you so much for helping to unearth what that even is for us.
And Andrea, if my last words are a question, is that a real scene behind you or a virtual scene?
Oh, that's real. This is the top terrace of my garden. We have a very rocky spot here in Belfast, and so we have some terraces going down the hill, and we put some poles up to support our beans and tomatoes. So that's
Well,
my
I
green
ask
garden.
because I get the strongest feeling that those trees and the breeze that's blowing them around are just applauding everything that you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. I so appreciate hearing that.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for your marvelous articulation of the needs of families and of the uniqueness of the presence of children who are different in our lives, and anybody who's diverse. And so I really applaud you for all the work that you're doing for the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, there's such an immense amount of wisdom in the ones that speak differently if we have ears to hear.
Oh.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.